Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GCP podcast Under the Gulmohar Tree. Just as the Gulmohar Tree symbolizes growth and resilience, Under the Gulmohar Tree brings operators, investors, and M&A professionals together to share insights on scaling mid-market businesses. Through candid conversations, we explore leadership, innovation, and value creation, uncovering lessons and strategies to help you grow and thrive. Hi, Michael. Welcome to Under the Gulmohar Tree podcast. We're really excited to have you here. Can you give our audience a quick introduction, how you started, where you are today, and we'll go to more deeper questions after that.
That sounds great. Well, first off, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. So a little bit about me. I started off in the Marine Corps, ended up getting into cybersecurity when I was at the Office of Management and Budget. So really involved in a lot of National Security Council initiatives, things like the cybersecurity framework, that sort of thing. I was at what is now CISA for a few years. I ran strategic initiatives there. So a lot of things like we reformed FISMA and the Cyber Information Sharing Act, those sorts of things. From there, I realized if I was going to stay in this industry, I needed to understand the other side. So I worked at PwC for a number of years, and then I moved into a CISO role at one of the larger law firms in the country. And last year, I founded Solstice Security.
That is awesome. Thank you, Michael. So, working at PwC, obviously, you've had a great career so far. What inspired you to start Solstice Security?
Well, I think there were a couple things. One of them was that I'm ever since I was in the government, I saw this gap in capability in cybersecurity. The internet, at least the commercial internet, is only about 32 years old. And so what I've seen is lots of companies with resources are able to secure themselves. And, and even there's some issues there because that's no guarantee that you're not going to be breached. But one of the things that I saw is that smaller and medium-sized businesses, especially medium-sized businesses, didn't have access to the same resources. So I really started it there to bring kind of like high-level Fortune 500 level advice to small and medium-sized businesses because I think they really need it. And they have both disadvantages, but they also have advantages being more flexible, smaller organizations, and able to adapt a little bit more easily than some of the larger ones.
Got it. Maybe talk to me a little bit more about this mid-market complexity, but not the same level of resources. So how are you bridging that gap today?
Well, I think a lot of it really gets into being able to bridge security and compliance. I know you all are focused on that quite a bit, but what I really see is lots of times everybody knows what they need to do, but they don't really understand what they have to do. And there's lots of different frameworks out there. There's ISO 27001, there's managed security providers who, run your IT and business IT, have lots of opinions and that sort of thing. But where I see the gap is, what are real fundamentally sound security principles? And then how do you translate those to other things like business risk, like, contractual risk when, as you grow, your customers may be asking you about your security program. And that tends to be a real struggle. And when do you want to invest resources into a bigger security team, or maybe having a part-time person help? So that fractional CISO, that vCISO concept that's out there. And so I think one of the issues with the mid-market is they struggle to get the top level talent that you really need in this environment. And so that leaves them a little bit kind of lost in the woods, if that makes sense. At the same time, they're smaller organizations. They can be more nimble. It's a lot easier for them to implement some of these things than much larger organizations. So it really is about connecting people with the best advice possible.
Makes sense. Thank you. If GRC and cybersecurity were invented today from scratch, talking about compliance and security, like you just mentioned, knowing what we know about the real breaches today, would they exist as separate functions even today?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think what we need to think about is as security as risk management, right? And they certainly wouldn't be the separate disciplines that they are today. That oftentimes, the GRC specialists or the people trying to manage, things like contractual or regulatory risk are often at odds with the technical people who are the foundation and they're trying to manage things like network risk or technical risk and that sort of thing. And so I think if we were rebuilding it today, what it should be built off of is a sound understanding of what works from a technical standpoint, from a data standpoint, from a business operations standpoint, because fundamentally what security is business risk. And there's a lot of different components to that, right? Like I said, a SOC may be focused on network risk or the risk of a data spillage, and a GRC team might be focused on making sure that we're meeting our client contractual requirements. I will tell you, as coming from a law firm, there are lots of people who care about how law firms operate their security program, and if we mess it up, we're opening ourselves up to a different sort of risk. So I think if we were rebuilding it today, we would look at it from that perspective. We would start with that first principle of, is this material to the business, to the organization? That comes from a great book called Cybersecurity First Principles by Rick Howard. And I really think that's the core of what it is. Is there something material to this organization? Now, how do we manage the different types of risk that we have?
Perfect. You mentioned this in a couple of different places, and I want to go deeper into it. Many organizations invest heavily in tools and talent, but still struggle with the outcomes within GRC and security. Do you think it's more misaligned incentives that could explain more of these failures in GRCS?
Well, the question of incentives is interesting because, what do you get rewarded on and what do you get measured on, right? Do you get measured on, the number of incidents you've handled, or have you made the issue with the client just go away? And so I think you're onto something there, because one of the things that I think the cybersecurity industry has just absolutely done a poor job on, and you're starting to see that change a little bit, but it's being able to translate technical risk into real business risk. Why should a CEO or a CFO care that you have an unpatched CV9 vulnerability on a web server and that you're going to have to interrupt the service to patch that? Why should they care about that? Well, the answer is because it might end up in a data breach, or it might end up in that service is going to be down for much longer when somebody gets into it. But we do a poor job of translating that. And and going back to that risk management piece, GRC and security should be things that are they're the same side of a single coin.
Completely agree with you, Michael. Just to follow up on that, are organizations rewarding the appearance of control rather than reduction of uncertainty?
Well, I don't know it's so much the appearance of control as it is the idea of control. And so thinking that they actually have it in control. I don't think that organizations are sitting there and saying, well, we're just going to gloss over this and it'll look like to everybody that we're good. I think what it is a failure to prioritize things that are important and to think about risk holistically. So, for instance, we'll go back to that unpatched vulnerability. Maybe there's a reporting requirement that you have to a client, and they just don't want to talk about it. But you've scanned you're scanning your network every month, So you're meeting the requirement of the contract. So I think it's not so much the appearance as that as the understanding of how these things work together. But there's definitely a disconnect.
Got it. Now, I want to discuss a topic. When there are breaches, obviously, many of these GRC and cybersecurity principles are intersecting. So, when you examine some major breaches like that, how often was a failure actually known but tolerated?
That's an interesting question. So it hits on one of the problems that we actually have in cybersecurity is that the empirical evidence around breaches is so fragmented, so distributed because everybody has it. So every breach is different. And sometimes you get pieces of it or sometimes you get a whole thing that comes out. But I think it often happens that there's known risks and people are making business decisions without fully understanding the downside. There's an interesting Expel just put out an interesting report about the mismatch of communications between CFOs and CISOs. And I hear it a lot from CISOs where, the business isn't prioritizing these really big risks, but at the same time, the CFOs are not understanding it because the CISOs and CFOs speak different dialects of the same language. So oftentimes there's things that are known, but the mitigations aren't invested in because there's miscommunications internally. And the ability to, again, translate that technical risk into a business impact, there's a breakdown there.
Got it. Makes sense. But let's say if the risk was known, why was that risk tolerated? What made it seem acceptable or rational at the time?
Well, I think it usually comes down to the cost. And I don't just mean a financial cost. For instance, there's a big risk we know a lot, organizations like Scattered Spider. They'll use known legitimate collaboration tools, IT support tools. They'll send a user a link and they'll execute that software. And then they have control, just like you call your IT and they take control of your computer, they'll take control of it and then they'll start exfiltrating data. And that can be solved through things like application allow listing, but that can be expensive and that can impact the way people do business. So that cost of I'm going to have to deal with angry people with an unclear rationale behind what the actual risk is from a business standpoint. I think that's why humans are good at rationalizing things when you have legit other reasons why you don't want to do it.
Makes sense. You touched upon the cost, Michael, so maybe let's talk about that for a minute. How to make the case of the GRC and cybersecurity tools to the CFO from an ROI perspective, right? Because many of these are precautionary in nature. And so if you were the CIO or CISO, how would you make a case to your CFO?
Well, I think the first thing that you need to talk about is how are you helping the business? And what I fundamentally think security is revenue protection. We are in the business of risk management, and it is our job to make sure that the business is successful and that they don't have to, as much as possible, we're going to take care of people so that they can accomplish their business objectives. They can keep, doing their work. And I think it's having a very clear understanding of what's important to the business that you start with and how are you going to protect that business. So for instance, we had a lot of unblocks in a law firm because, you don't want people going to unsafe sites and that sort of thing when they hit a web block. But there's a lot of reasons that a lawyer might be going to a risky site. They might be working on behalf of a client for a cease and desist letter. And so prioritizing those unblocks and getting them moving as fast as possible to keep, because lawyers' time is money, legit. Everybody's is, but lawyers in a billable hours, it really matters. So I think like to prioritize these things, you have to adjust them to what your business works at. And the second piece is, talk about it in terms that they understand. Most business leadership comes from a CFO community. They understand the metrics of money very well. So, what is the risk? What is the likelihood that something's going to have a material impact on them? And that starts to shift the conversation away from security being a cost center to it being a strategic enabler, to it being protection of revenue.
Got it. Completely makes sense. Like talking now a little bit more about cost and mid-market that we touched upon earlier. Let's maybe go deeper into mid-market organizations for a minute because that's an area we spend a lot of time in as well. So does
Right.
our portfolio company, Currentware. Mid-market organizations, as we know, rarely have the luxury of specialized teams, talent, as you mentioned, or deep redundancy, right? Does that constraint make them weaker or in some ways more resilient than the others?
Well, I think without the benefit of really understanding what they should be focused on, I think it makes them weaker because it tends to be scattershot. Where should they focus? What are the fundamentals? The first thing is access control. So most of these businesses are now running on cloud. It may be easier just to have a username and password, but actually a lot of what the cloud companies are doing are making it easier to go with MFA through things like passkeys and stuff like that. So I think I should back up a little bit. When we think about resilience is two things, right? It is making something less likely to happen, and it is, when it does happen, make it less bad. And I think that example goes into that first one of that it's more difficult to figure out what they should be doing because we don't have great just baselines for that. It can be very, very complex and opaque. But at the same time, because they're smaller organizations, they may be able to recover more quickly. They may have less legacy infrastructure that they have to deal with or bring back up. They may be entirely in the cloud, and it's a lot easier to back things up, just entirely in the cloud. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I think fundamentally, when push comes to shove, it comes down on probably a little bit less resilient because they don't have access to those best security practices.
Great points. No conversations these days will be complete without AI. So, just a question on if AI can close the GRC and security gap or give us faster ways to manufacture false confidence, right? So, both of these are equally likely today, depending on how you really implement AI. What is your view on that, Michael?
Yes to both. Fundamentally, and I say that because it goes back to how are we thinking about risk? Are we thinking about, hey, we've got all our documentation for our ISO 27001 done, so we must be secure? Or are we thinking about, take audit or assurance, for example? We put in place these good, solid security practices. Internal audit, I always think of as, are we actually doing what we think we're doing? Are our controls working as we think they are? And I think AI is really helpful in being able to start to parse out a lot of that information, get signals from noise to help us improve operations. But if we're just taking it and saying, hey, we've fulfilled all of our regulatory requirements or our compliance requirements, okay, maybe that's helping you with business risk, but you're not addressing some of the real technical risks that you have. So I think it's a mixed bag, and I think it depends on how we go. And with that said, I will give a little bit, I will put a little skepticism out there in that I think a lot of AI, especially when you think about it like a SOC analyst, we're going to have an automated SOC analyst. And, fundamentally, you can give AI the same set of data in the exact same way multiple times, and it may not come up with the same answer every time. And so 90% accuracy isn't something that really is acceptable in security. But you can use it to make humans more effective. So I think the model in which we try to use it, for instance, instead of having the AI agent replace the SOC analyst, perhaps the AI agent assist in gathering all the information, and then the SOC analyst does what a human's good at and makes connections and determines whether this is a bad thing or a good thing, rather than putting that all on AI. So I think the model that we approach it with matters as well.
Completely agree. Michael, two last questions as we wrap up. It's a board level discussion now. GRC and security is no longer under the covers, under the table.
Mm-hmm.
If you had 5 minutes with the board, let's say of a mid-market company, what uncomfortable truth about risk and security would you force them to confront, and why?
Do you know the probability of a material security incident in the next 12 months and how much that will cost you? And I think, when we strip it away, that you can't say, well, we've met all of our ISO or SOC 2 requirements. We haven't, or we have all of our, vulnerabilities are patched within, 2 hours, or, for criticals or whatever it may be. And we've got them all done internally. Those are pieces of a pie, but it doesn't get into starting to think about the actual risk and starting to think about it in a way that again, most of these people are coming from a financial background that they understand. And if they're not capable of answering that question, why? Do they have the team in place? Do they have the metrics in place? Do they have the tooling in place? Do they have even the ability to comply? So lots of times, I'll take an ISO 27001. I don't love those security controls, but being able to do it tells me something about an organization. Having a SAC 2 gets a little bit more technical, and it tells me something about an organization. But it doesn't get to that question of what is the probability of a material incident in the next 12 months.
Fantastic. Last question as we wrap up the podcast today, Michael. What advice would you give to budding GRC and cybersecurity practitioners today, whether it's courses, practice on a few different problems, or getting some job experience in certain categories or industries? What would be your advice?
Just clarification, you're speaking more about people who are pursuing GRC or security in general, like GRC, SOC?
All of the above. GRC and cybersecurity, right? As we call GRCS.
I think what's important is to understand what you don't understand. If you're a person who's technically inclined, if you're a SOC analyst and you love diving into the technical details, that's amazing. That's what we build security off of. But it's not the only thing. So start to understand why do we need cybersecurity policies? So we have something that governs how people operate outside of the SOC. What does your company care about? Or what does your organization care about if you're not in a private sector company? And, how do you think about risk, and how do you communicate these issues? It's one of the things I see a lot on the technical side. And it comes down to two things. It's being able to understand the broader world, and then being able to translate what you know into that broader world. And then on the GRC side, get technical. Yeah, you don't have to be able to spin up a virtual server or tune, an endpoint detection and response tool, but you do need to understand what it means. If you're sitting there and there's a technical term that you don't understand, Google's a wonderful tool. I mean, this is how I learned it. I have a political science degree, and I just sat and I read and I read and I read, and anytime something came up in the situations I was in and I didn't understand it, I went and Googled it. And then if I didn't understand it from that, or I felt like I didn't understand it as well, keep learning. But always keep learning. And so the last piece of that is, as long as the technology changes, as long as we have more computing power, your job's going to change. And so, just think if a lot of the great engineers were still operating on best practices from 15 years ago. Yeah, that's not very long, but it's a very, very different world. So technology will change. Always keep learning.
Great advice. Thank you, Michael. We are lucky. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure our audience will love it as well. Thanks once again.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.